requirement, what it works, how it works. Oop, got it. So in essence, we need you to be forthcoming with questions. This presentation will be as good as your questions. We want to make sure that you understand what it takes to apply for this type of program and the process and what it takes. But the reality is that this is a program like nothing that we have seen flexibility-wise into the amount of things that we can do in the landscape. I want to take advantage of that. That goes from wildlife to flood control to anything in between. And Jason's strength is going to explain you all the opportunities. Now, something that is very important to state, this program is not necessarily what I would like to call a sprint. It is something that it has some time associated with it. We go from phases, for lack of better terms, and Jason will go over these phases of the program. But I want to make sure that expectations are gauged accordingly with the requirements of the program. And we have a step that goes from feasibility to a planning to the design and implementation, so that sometimes is when folks see the timeline associated, sometimes they say like, well, I wanted something faster, but the reality is that the resources that this program could come to bear, it is substantial. And that's what it makes the difference. The potential of the funding that we could successfully bring to the state of Florida through this program, you will see the opportunities. And that's what I'm hoping. We're hoping that applicants will see the opportunities and will be able to put an application for. But with that, I'm very much looking forward to get applications and see how we can get this program moving in the state of Florida. So with that, I want to yield the floor to Jason so that he can start the presentation. Sadly, I do have a conflict schedule that I need to drop off, but Jason and Cynthia will provide me a briefing of any of your questions and how the presentation went. But with that, I wanted to thank you in advance for your interest and have a great afternoon. Thank you all.
Thank you, Juan. Yeah, as Juan stated, my name is Jason Strength. I'm State Conservation Engineer for NRCS in Florida. And I appreciate everyone joining today to listen to our presentation. Today, I'm going to discuss the Watershed and Flood Prevention Operations Program that NRCS has and how you may utilize that to work in your area. It's a very encompassing program, as Juan stated, and so I'll go over the program and not in in somewhat detail. We're not going to get into the weeds, but give you a basic overview of the program. Hold on, I'm having technical difficulties. Hold on, something. All right. Sorry about that. Yeah, the agenda today, I'm going to talk, well, I'm having some more technical difficulties here. Bear with me. All right. Going to give you an overview of basically the Watershed Flood Prevention Operations Program. And let me apologize in advance. This program has multiple names that NRCS calls it, okay? One of them is Watershed Flood Prevention Operations Program. One is, we just shorten it, called the Watershed Operations Program. And we also call it the PL-566 program, which PL is the public law that basically authorizes this program. So I'm going to probably call it PL-566 at times. I'm probably going to call it Watershed Operations Program at times. So I apologize. Government, especially in NRCS, we have these acronyms that we like to go by, and some folks that probably not familiar with NRCS may get confused. But that's basically what what we utilize. So I apologize in advance. And the next bullet, PL-566 background. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Going to talk a little bit about the purpose and need of the program and what's the difference between the purpose and the need. I'm going to talk about the requirements of the program, financial assistance involved in it, the different phases of the program, the different steps for assistance, and at the end, we're going to have a question and answer session. So if you have, any questions that you're thinking about as I go through the program, you'll have a chance to ask them at the end. Hopefully I can answer them. If not, we will get back with you on an answer. All right. So the Watershed Operations Program, basically the Flood Control Act of 1944 and the Watershed Flood Prevention Act of PL-566 are the foundational legislation for the operations program. The purpose of the program was to authorize the Natural Resources Conservation Service, formerly the Soil Conservation Service, to provide assistance in the planning and installation of flood control measures to reduce losses caused by flooding. It's got several general purposes, 3 of them actually. One is preventing damage from erosion, floodwater, and sediment. Second one is furthering the conservation, development, utilization, and disposal of water. And the third is furthering the conservation and proper utilization of land. Watershed program requires the development of physically, environmentally, socially, economically sound watershed project plans with action scheduled for implementation over a specified period of years. Watershed projects contain project actions which are formally planned undertakings carried out within a specific geographic area by sponsors for the benefit of the general public. Now I'm going to go into the authorized purposes. There I mentioned the general purposes. These are the authorized purposes for the actual program, okay? As you can see, you've got flood prevention, watershed protection, public recreation, public fish and wildlife, agricultural water management, municipal and industrial water supply, water quality management, and watershed structure rehabilitation. Okay, and I'm going to go through each one of those and give you some general ideas of what each of those authorized purposes can encompass. Flood prevention. Flood prevention is the main overarching original purpose of this program. That's the one that most folks utilize it for. Historically, that's the one NRCS has utilized the most. So I'm going to probably go in a little more detail on that one. And it basically is flood prevention or flood damage reduction measures installed to prevent or reduce damages caused by floodwater. Flood damage reduction is further defined as the control and dispersal of surface water caused by abnormally high direct precipitation, stream overflow, or floods aggregated or caused by wind or tidal effects. Flood damage reduction and mitigation measures reduce or prevent floodwater damages by reducing runoff, erosion, sediment, modifying the susceptibility of improvements in the floodplain, the damage, removing damageable property from the floodplain, or reducing the frequency, depth, and velocity of flooding. Measures under this purpose vary. One of them could be the removal or relocation of existing properties within the floodplain. If there's properties, homes, or businesses that flood frequently, this program could be utilized to remove those properties, either move them out of the floodplain or just basically remove them completely, where basically demolish the building. It could be a flood warning system, where if there's an area that floods frequently, maybe there's a warning system that can alert residents that there's a potential flood coming. Another option in here is flood proofing, where you may go in and do some measures where it flood proofs the homes. Maybe put some walls around, elevated walls where it keeps flooding from the homes. You could just basically raise properties is one option too in this under this purpose. You could do some floodplain and wetland acquisition. That's another measure that's involved in this particular purpose. And then you have your engineered practices that NRCS utilizes on our typical work under EQIP. You would have dikes. You could have great stabilization structures. You could have basically doing some channel work to increase the capacity of the channel. You could do some sediment basins within the drainage area. So this purpose, like I said, it has a lot of potential, and that's one that's utilized the most under this program. The next purpose we've got is watershed protection. Watershed protection consists of land treatment practices within a watershed that result in reduced off-site flooding, erosion, sediment, and agricultural pollutants. Project measures result in conserved or developed soil, improved water quality or quantity, enhancements to woodland, fish and wildlife habitat, recreation, and scenic resources. This particular purpose is very broad. You know, you can utilize pretty much any of our conservation practice standards that we utilize in NRCS. You can use pretty much any of those under this particular purpose. As I mentioned, some of them earlier could be, you know, grade stabilization structure. You could use some waterways and terraces on farm fields. You know, any of our forestry type practices to be utilized under this particular purpose. So it's very broad. An example, in Tennessee, they had an old mining site that was just outside of a town, and this mining site was in the headwaters of a creek that flowed right through that particular town, and it resulted in basically acid mine drainage going in that creek and killing off all aquatic life in that particular creek. So this purpose was utilized to help restore aquatic life to that creek, and it also benefited you know, the area from a recreation standpoint, because you know, you had a fishing area. You had fish, people wanted to go fish. It was a recreational area. You know, they could do kayaking and canoeing. So there's a lot of potential in this one also. It's very broad. The next purpose is public recreation. Under this purpose, you know, a sponsor could utilize this to create picnic areas, fishing piers, shelters, cooking areas, swimming beaches, you know, walking trails, anything that would help, you know, basically benefit public recreation. You know, you know, there's always that potential in a lot of our projects to, not only help the environment, but also provide a benefit to the general public in recreation. So that's one purpose for this program. The next purpose is public fish and wildlife. Public fish and wildlife purpose involves the improvement of the habitat or the environment for the breeding, growth, and development of fish and wildlife. Okay, some of our projects, you know, we may be doing some erosion control or flood prevention, but we also have the potential to add in, you know, benefits for public fish and wildlife. Okay, maybe you know helping with the breeding, or you know better habitat for actual, you know, helping the wildlife. One example, if we were doing a say a dam, for example, there's a potential where you could you know, change the water levels within that behind that dam that would benefit wildlife, maybe waterfowl, for instance. So there's that potential there under that purpose to help, you know, some side benefits, if you will. The next purpose we're going to talk about is agricultural water management. This purpose includes drainage, groundwater recharge, irrigation, water conservation, water quality improvement, and agricultural, including rural communities' water supply. Work in this purpose must serve groups of landowners and communities. It can't serve just one landowner. Some of the measures that could be utilized in this particular purpose would be drainage. You know, it could be on-farm drainage through, you know, surface drainage, subsurface drainage. That's one purpose. Could be groundwater recharge. If that's a need in the area, could provide some basins to help recharge the groundwater. Under irrigation, we could help with, you know, if there's some regional irrigation reservoirs that need to be built, that's an option. If there's channels that need to be built to help transfer or convey the irrigation water, that's an option. Or just going and working with local landowners within the watershed and help increase the efficiency of their irrigation. That's definitely an option under this particular purpose, and it's utilized quite a bit. Out west, western part of the U.S., irrigation is done a little different, and they do a lot of their irrigation through canals, as I mentioned, and some of these earthen canals they have seepage issues, so we have loss of irrigation water. So what they do out there is sometimes they'll go back and they'll line these channels so you don't have any seepage issues, or they may just pipe the water instead of a canal. They may just do a big pipe. Here in Florida, most of our irrigation water is from groundwater, so maybe that doesn't fit 100% with Florida, but there is a lot of potential under agricultural water management to benefit Florida. The next one is municipal and industrial water supply. This purpose covers those measures necessary to provide storage capacity in reservoirs to increase the availability of water for present and future municipal and industrial use. Under this purpose, NRCS can work with sponsors to cover the cost of outlet works and pipelines to convey water from water bodies to existing or proposed treatment facilities or water systems. Now, that's not one that we typically work on much. Now, we may include it, as one of the purposes under one of our projects, but at least in my experience, we haven't utilized it as our main primary purpose. The next one is water quality management. Okay, water quality management measures provide water storage capacity in reservoirs for regulation of stream flow to improve water quality in streams. Okay, so that purpose there is pretty straightforward. We're just improving water quality in the streams. That's pretty straightforward. That could be done with multiple measures. It could be some of those watershed protection measures I mentioned earlier, whether it be buffers, nutrient management within the watershed, something to that effect. So it, like I said, it's mainly focused on water quality, but how you achieve it, there's varied options on how we could do that. The last purpose I'm going to hit on, and it's not one that we would probably use in Florida anytime soon, and that's the watershed structure rehabilitation. This one here is for dams that were built under either Public Law 566 or Public Law 534, and those dams are now causing basically a safety hazard or have exceeded their life. NRCS will pay to go back in and upgrade those dams to meet current safety standards. In Florida, we don't have any dams that would be considered high hazard dams, and which is basically the only thing they're working on right now. Any dams that NRCS has worked on under these programs in Florida would be low hazard, so thus they would not be eligible for this particular purpose. All right, so I want to give you just a quick history of the program in Florida. As you can see there, that's an old picture taken in Okeechobee County in 1956. And no, I did not take that picture. So not quite that old. I don't know who did that. But basically back in the late 50s, NRCS started working with local sponsors under this program for flood protection. And this is pretty much what we did back in the 50s and 60s, on up into the 70s. What NRCS did in Florida was basically take or create channels. Some of them were natural channels that we, increased the capacity of. Some we dug the channel, created the channels to help drain the area. A lot of that was done in South Florida, some in Central Florida too. That was kind of the typical way you did flood prevention back in the 60s and 70s, and like I said, back in the 50s too. So this is here is one of the canals that we would have constructed. Also, to help regulate water level and regulate flow in these channels, we would install these structures like this one shown. This is a radial gate structure. You know, it helps regulate the flow in the channel. We would, you know, lower the channel during the summertime, you know, in the wet season. And the sponsor they'll raise the water level in the dry season. Also, these channels, you know, provide grade control because we're, you know, dropping, you know, channels in elevation, you know, outlet into the Atlantic or Gulf of Mexico. So we had to basically drop the channel, and so we utilize these also for grade control, dropping elevation. Historically, over the years, NRCS has utilized the program to build roughly 12,000 what we call floodwater retarding dams. Okay, so other states, say Texas, Oklahoma, Georgia, typically they would build dams. Florida was not as conducive to building dams because of the soils and topography. So we didn't really build a lot of dams. We built these structures in these constructed channels. Now, more recently, we have done some work, you know, under this program in what we call the Middle Swanee area around Live Oak. We work with, you know, poultry and dairy producers on waste management systems to help keep nutrients out of the Swanee River. You know, we would help them, you know, design facilities to collect their waste, store their waste, and you know, apply it, you know, in an environmental friendly way. So that's the most recent history we've had in Florida. But I just want to give you a historical perspective of what we would have done, say, 60 years ago. All right, purpose and need. You know, that's something that I mentioned earlier, and basically how it works is, you know, there has to be a need, you know, and that would be, you know, in NRCS terms, we may say, what is the resource concern? Or, you know, in layman's terms, we may say, what is the issue? So the need is, what is the issue? And the purpose would be, okay, how do we address that and fit it within this program? Okay, so, you know, when I'm talking right now, you know, you may be having some ideas. Okay, this program could be utilized. Say, for instance, there's some flooding in a town that, you know, it floods some homes and some farms. You know, every time we get a large rain event, we get some flooding issues. You know, you may have an idea. Okay, we've got an existing channel. You know, we can just widen that channel out, and that's what, you know, you may have been, you know, thinking about that, and that may be a viable option. But how NRCS would look at it, we would look at that need. The need is to stop the flooding of the homes and the farms and businesses. Okay, so what purpose would that apply to? That would apply to flood prevention. So that's how we would look at it. I mean, we wouldn't go in, you know, thinking that there's only one alternative. We're going to go in and look at multiple alternatives under this program. So, you know, like I said, you may come in with a general idea of how to correct the issue, and there's nothing wrong with that. But like I said, we have to look at it, you know, over the whole watershed, look at it from an environmental standpoint, a cultural standpoint, economic standpoint. So that's where we got to have the need, and then we've got to fit that with a purpose. All right, some statutory requirements. The sponsor must meet eligibility requirements, and I'll go over those on the next slide. What requires or what makes a sponsor eligible. The request for each project must be $25 million or less. Now, the caveat to that is if you've got a project that's going to cost more than $25 million, that in essence does not disqualify you. The problem is that must get approved through Congress. And so that takes a little more time. So what we try to do is recommend, you know, making your request less than $25 million. That's going to speed it up a little bit. You know, you got to imagine the time it takes to get things through Congress. Agricultural benefits, including those to rural communities, must comprise at least 20%. And as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at economic benefits mainly, but also looking at cultural and just benefits to society in general. So that's a big point right there, the 20%. So basically, I mean, if you're in a somewhat rural area, you're probably going to be okay. If you're in downtown Jacksonville or downtown Miami, it's probably not going to meet that 20%. The project acreage must be less than 250,000 acres in size. The project does not include any single structure, and this is floodwater retarding structure that provides more than 12,500 acre feet of floodwater detention capacity. So that applies back to those dams that I mentioned earlier that NRCS/SCS built, over the years. So if you're not dealing with any type of floodwater retarding structure, then obviously that would not apply. And the project provides no more than 25,000 acre feet of total capacity. And that again, could apply to floodwater dams, as I mentioned earlier. All right, sponsor requirements. Okay, so let's show you what makes a sponsor eligible. Must be a state or local unit of government, tribal organization in certain districts under state law. So, all of your cities, counties, state governments, those are eligible. And there also would be soil and water conservation districts. Those would be eligible. And then we have, in Florida, we have these improvement districts, drainage districts, irrigation districts. Most of those would be eligible sponsors also. Must have the power of eminent domain. This is not required for projects where all work will be installed by land treatment long-term contracts. Okay, so in this particular project, need eminent domain in case we are doing something, whether it be building some sort of structure, maybe you're enlarging a canal or waterway and you need to acquire land. Okay, so that's the reason that this particular requirement is needed. If we're doing everything on basically local landowners' property where there is no need to acquire property, doing it through what we call long-term contracts, working with individual landowners, then power of eminent domain is not needed. Must acquire needed permits and licenses in accordance with local, state, and federal law. So the sponsor, will be required to get the needed permits and work with the needed permitting agency. Must have the authority to levy taxes. And the reason that being is, there may be some need to add some cost share in kind, if you will, to the project. Okay, so maybe there needs to be some taxes raised to help fund this program. There's going to need, some needed operation and maintenance. Maybe need to raise taxes to provide the needed operation and maintenance. So you must have the authority. Doesn't say you have to, just got to have the authority. Must show evidence of commitment for funding, installing, operating, and maintaining the project. And as I mentioned earlier, must operate and maintain the works of improvement. Okay, any of this stuff I've talked about is great, but if it's not operated correctly, and definitely if it's not maintained, properly through its lifespan, it's not gonna work as intended. So maybe there, if you're looking at, say, doing something with a channel, got to go out there and make sure that the channel stays clear. And if you've got a structure that I showed earlier, one of those structures that has to be operated, somebody's got to go out there and be able to raise those gates. So there's always going to be some maintenance involved and typically some operation involved too. So these are basically the requirements for sponsors to be eligible. All right, and you've probably been wanting to know, what about financial assistance? Okay, this program sounds great, but how much do I need to put in versus how much is the federal government going to provide? Okay, as you can see here, these are basically all those purposes that I listed earlier. And also you see what the cost share percentage is. Say flood prevention. We've got for engineering and technical assistance, it's going to be 100% federal NRCS. Okay, installation and construction, it's 100%. But there's 0 on real property rights. That goes, back to the responsibility of the sponsor. Watershed protection, and that's the one that it was very broad. And you can see there, the engineering technical assistance is also 100%, but the installation and cost is variable. And that goes back to, we utilize our conservation practice standards, as I mentioned earlier, maybe it's a diversion, waterway, terrace, something like that. Typically we utilize those. And so we have a different cost share programs for those. EQIP is our biggest one. And so that falls back into the cost share ratio for, say, EQIP. Okay. So in a lot of our EQIP practices are 75% cost share. So that's where that would apply. That's why we send variable, because it goes back to the local state cost share rate for that particular practice that we're utilizing. So it's really hard to say right now until which practices you're going to utilize. You can see public recreation. It's 100% on engineering technical assistance, but does not exceed 50% on installation and does not exceed 50% on real property rights. Public fish and wildlife, it's the same. It's 100% on engineering technical assistance, not to exceed 50% on installation and construction, and real property rights. Now, if you look at agricultural water management, it's engineering technical assistance is up to 100%, and construction is up to 75%. Okay, and then if you look at municipal and industrial water supply, it's 0% on engineering technical assistance, and installation would be not to exceed 50%. And water quality management could be up to 100% on engineering and technical assistance. And then you would have to look at the different measures you're doing to determine the installation and construction of that. So as you can see, for majority of these purposes, NRCS would pay 100% of the engineering of it, and at least 50% on most of the purposes on the construction side. But there are some no property rights. That would be the responsibility of the sponsor. All right, so I'm gonna go over the phases of this particular program. There's 4 major phases. Phase 1 is our preliminary investigation and feasibility report. Okay, that's kind of the first step, and I'll go over each one of these in detail. The next step would be the watershed plan, and that would include environmental assessment in coordination with responsible agencies. The third phase would be the design of the actual measure. Okay, and that could be one particular measure, or it could be multiple measures, whatever is determined in the watershed plan. And the final phase would be the construction phase. Okay, and typically the construction is done by the sponsor. They basically handle the construction. NRCS provides some assistance in it, but that can be NRCS provide doing the construction end of it, but typically the sponsor does that. So let's talk a little bit about the preliminary investigation and feasibility report. As I mentioned earlier, NRCS, we have these acronyms, and for this one we call it the PIFR. That's just what they want to call it, so we'll go forward with it. PIFR is basically a brief study using existing data and field information to provide reasonable assurances that it's a feasible project and that there are no apparent insurmountable obstacles. Okay, you would look at it, is there cultural resource issues that we may run into? Is there major permitting problems that may come about? And it's used by the state conservationists to make the determination if a potential project to be advanced for the planning, in the funding of this particular request. So the PIFR, it's pretty short. It's not long and detailed, but it does provide us with some general basic information to help us make a determination if we want to move forward with this project. This report may be completed fully or only up to the point where we determine there is an issue. Okay. There's no sense going all the way through the report if we determine pretty quickly that we're going to have something, an issue that we're not going to overcome. It's completed, by NRCS, or it's the responsibility of NRCS to complete this report. And of course, we get assistance from the sponsor. We always want to work with a sponsor. This is a locally driven program, and so the sponsor is intimately involved in it. And we would get their input in this particular phase here. The PIFR. So the next phase would be the watershed planning. Okay, if the PIFR looked like everything turned out good and there's no apparent insurmountable obstacles, and the sponsor wants to move forward, then we would go into the planning phase. And just want to briefly discuss some of the contents of the watershed plan. It's pretty lengthy, but we would have to have that purpose and need. As I mentioned earlier, what's the need, what's the issue, and how does it fit in one of our authorized purposes? Okay, that's got to be in the plan. Scope of the environmental assessment and environmental impact statement. So anything we do, we've got to look at from the environmental standpoint. What's the affected environment? Okay. What are alternatives considered? As I mentioned earlier, we can't just look at one alternative. We may have a general idea what's going in, what's the best alternative, but we need to look at multiple alternatives, okay, and evaluate each one from an economics and environmental, social, cultural standpoint. And then, use that data to help drive what is the selected alternative. The environmental consequences of our selected alternative and the other alternative. And then the final would be the preferred alternative. Okay, what are we going to do? Is it going to be, one particular measure, or are there going to be multiple measures that we utilize to, make this purpose and need, come to fruition? Or excuse me, let this purpose come to fruition. We know what the need is. We need to basically solve what the issue is. All right, some time frames. Okay, just to give you a general idea, these are kind of expected time frames of each of these phases. The PIFR, we're looking at, as I stated earlier, it's going to be short and utilize existing data typically. So roughly 6 months at the most is what we're looking at. And as I stated, that's a responsibility of NRCS. So the sponsor would have input, but that they're not responsible for it. The plan is up to 18 months. Okay. Now there may be some plans that's going to be simple, pretty short, may take, less than that. And there's the extreme that may take a little more than 18 months, but the goal is to get them completed within 18 months. The design could be up to 24 months. Okay. Depending on what the plan calls for, how many different measures, and different, structures or what have you. And then you look at the construction side, again, depending on what we're doing in the plan, you're looking at 2 to 3 years. So as Juan mentioned earlier, this is not a sprint. And so this table right here kind of shows you that you're looking at potentially 5-6 years is kind of what you're looking at in that ballpark. And it varies, of course. If you've got a small project, maybe a little sooner. A large one, obviously, it's going to take longer. So that kind of gives you an idea on the time frame. So as Juan mentioned, don't expect if you request funding that we're going to be done with construction in less than a year. It doesn't work that quickly because these are meant to be watershed scale projects. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is the steps that are needed to request assistance or to get assistance from NRCS under this program. The first is a sponsor requests NRCS assistance via a letter to the state conservationist, Juan Hernandez in this case, and complete a simple checklist. Excuse me. Florida NRCS submits funding requests to develop the PIFR. So we would, after we receive the sponsor's request, we would submit the funding request to National NHQ, or excuse me, National NRCS to fund this PIFR. If funded, the PIFR is developed with, again, with assistance from the sponsor. After the PIFR is completed, and if this project is determined to be feasible, sponsor submits formal application. Okay, now the formal application is not a letter. It's there's more paperwork than that, unfortunately. If y'all have ever been involved in any federal program, there's a standard form 424, which is a federal application for assistance, and that's basically what you utilize. It's, I think it's 3 or 4 pages, and there's some other documentation, but it's a little more formal than just a letter. All right, after we receive that formal application, then Florida NRCS submits funding requests for the watershed planning phase. And if funded, watershed plan is developed by NRCS and the sponsor. As I stated earlier, this is a locally led program. So, you know, we're going to be working with the sponsor, you know, as we go along. It's just not, we're not going to be in a vacuum. You know, there has to be a lot of interaction between NRCS and the sponsor during this phase. After the plan is completed, and if available funding, the design is completed by NRCS, okay? And then, again, if funding is available, then construction is completed via sponsor contracting, as I mentioned earlier. Now, all these steps that I've just noted on this slide and the previous slide, they're all contingent upon available funding, and requests are ranked and selected by the NRCS National Headquarters, okay? Funding of any of the above steps does not guarantee funding of the next step, unfortunately. So that's one thing you need to remember. Just because you get funded for the planning phase, you may not get funded for the design, and or you know, if you get funded for the design, you may not get funded for the construction. So unfortunately, that's one of the things that you need to be thinking about. You know that's just something we have to deal with. There may not be available funds for everybody. So that's kind of the steps needed in a nutshell. And that's pretty much all I have on the program side of it. Here's my contact information on the screen. Also, if you would like additional information, here's where you can find it. You know, the website there, and you go on NRCS programs, landscape planning, and then a watershed and flood prevention operations program. So I'm going to sit here for a second. If you need to write any of this down, I'll let you write it down before I proceed to the next slide. All right, so let's recap what we've talked about. We've talked about basically the background of the PL-566 or Watershed Operations Program available through NRCS. We've talked about the purpose and need. You know, there's a need or an issue, resource concern, and how do we fit that in one of those authorized purposes. We talked about the requirements, not only of the program requirements, but also of the sponsor requirements. You know, what determines an eligible sponsor. We talked about the amount of financial assistance that's available under the established purposes. I've walked you through the different phases, the 4 different phases of the program. And then we talked about the different steps that are needed for assistance. Now we're going to open it up to our question and answer session. And just to close this out, this was the first dam constructed under the Flood Control Act of 1944 in Oklahoma. So this program, or you know, the predecessor of this program, has been around since 1944. So that's you know, quite a while ago. So just to give you a perspective of, you know, some of the work that NRCS has done, as I stated, you know, we've installed roughly 12,000 dams under this program across the nation. Now, granted, installing dams or constructing dams is not as easy as it once was, and maybe not as favorable as it once was back, in 40s or 50s, 60s or whatever. But that's kind of, like I said, that was the heart of this project back in the 60s. So that's pretty much my my presentation. So I guess we can open it up for questions. Cynthia, if anybody has a question.
I'm not seeing anything in the chat, so we'll just open it up. Whoever would like to go first, please feel free to unmute and ask away. Any questions? Wow, Jason, you did awesome. No one has any questions.
Yeah, well, that can be good and bad. Maybe I confuse them. They don't know what to ask. Hopefully not. But now, one thing I will emphasize, that if you have a project that you feel like may be a fit for this program, or maybe not, but if you just have a general idea, reach out to us and say, okay, this is what we're thinking about, and we can give you some feedback, and it it doesn't hurt to submit a request to do the PIFR. Like I said, it's funded 100% by NRCS. So the sponsor for the PIFR is not out any financial, based on not out any money. It's not a financial obligation to the sponsor. So that's on NRCS. So if you have a project that you think may fit, get in contact with us and we can discuss it and see if it, we want to move, if it's worth moving forward and submitting a request to do the PIFR. That's the first step anyway. So that I would definitely, advise you at least reach out to us and let's have that discussion.
Great. Thank you, Jason. And thank you everyone for participating and listening in. Maybe a few of you were on the first call. We will be uploading the recording probably within about a week, maybe sooner, to our website. So you'll be able to come back and re-watch it if you like. And as always, thank you. And please reach out to us if you have any questions that come up after the meeting. We're here for you. And Jason is, oh, we have a hand raised. I'm not sure whose email. It says Weeksa, but if you'd go ahead and unmute. And
I was just applauding him. I wasn't raising my hand. I was just applauding him for
okay.
very, very good presentation. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Does anyone else have anything they would like to ask or say? Well, if not, then this concludes our presentation, and we want to thank everyone for participating and have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.